Good morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hoosier Property Taxes, where we've been and where we're going. My name is Sarah Waddle, and I'm the State Director here for AARP Indiana. We are hosting this event today because property taxes are critical to the well-being of our communities, but older Hoosiers cannot always afford them. This is especially true when they are experiencing property tax increases on top of other rising monthly expenses like groceries and utilities and healthcare. AARP Indiana will be fighting for legislation to keep property taxes affordable during this year at the State House. At the end of today's event, we will give you some information about how you can help join these efforts. We hope that you find today's event informative. And now I'm going to introduce you to AARP Indiana's Legislative Director, Amber Marr.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Amber Marr, and I'm the Legislative Director for AARP Indiana. We're excited about today's discussion. We have a great lineup of guests, so let's get started. I'm thrilled to introduce our first speaker, Larry DeBoer. Larry is Professor Emeritus of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. He retired in 2021 after 37 years at Purdue. He is an expert on state and local public policy, especially issues in Indiana property taxation. Larry continues to share his expertise through consulting with research and policy organizations, through a monthly column about Indiana and national economic topics called Capital Comments, and the occasional presentation. Thank you so much for being here with us, Larry. If it's okay, I'm going to turn it over to you to discuss the historical trends of property taxes in Indiana. And although we have had a little technical difficulty with this camera, I promise you the information is still going to be great. Thank you so much, Larry. Take it over.
All right. Thanks very much, Amber. And I hope you can all hear me. Apparently, my computer wishes me to remain anonymous, but I can assure you I really am Larry DeBoer, and I'm here to talk to you about 50 years of Indiana property tax policy. I got to tell you that I did this talk for an Association of Assessors convention last week, and it took me 2.5 hours, but I will try to do it in 12 minutes here for the AARP. First thing to point out is that property taxes are actually pretty low in Indiana, and here's some information from the American Community Survey of 2023 that's run by the U.S. Census, and they do this annually. And the median value of property taxes paid by an Indiana homeowner was $1,730 in 2023. You'll notice off to the right that the average for the U.S. was $3,400. So Indiana taxes about half what they were in the U.S. We rank 33rd highest among all of the states. And as a percentage of income, which I think is maybe the best way to measure the burden of property taxes, what share of your income do you pay to those taxes, it's 1.8%. Also compare it to Illinois, our highest property tax next door neighbor, at $5,600 and 4.9%. And if anyone knows anybody living on the Illinois border or someone from Illinois, I'm sure they can tell you all about it. However, that is not to say that what has happened over the last couple of years is unimportant. It certainly is important. In fact, if you took a look at the data from the survey from 2022, Indiana that year ranked 44th. So we moved up from 44th to 33rd in just 1 year. Now, property taxes are rising everywhere, but apparently they're rising faster in Indiana than in most other states. Next slide, please. What can be done about this? Well, take a look at this chart. This is a history of property taxes as a share of income all the way from 1951 to the present. And look at 1972 there. At that time, property taxes were about 5% of Hoosier incomes, just like it is in Illinois today. So without property tax reforms that have happened in the last 50 years, our taxes would be about as high as they are in Illinois. But there's been quite a few, and I should say successful, efforts to reduce property taxes in Indiana since then. In particular, by the Otis Bowen administration in the 1970s, and that's where you see the drop from 5% to 2.5%. And then the administration of Governor Daniels starting in, the efforts starting in 2006 and continuing through 2021 through subsequent administrations. So the property tax relief efforts of the past have worked. Now, it turns out that there have been several episodes over this period of time where there were great big increases in assessed value, mostly due to statewide reassessments. And those increased property taxes. And every time that happened, the legislature and the governor would add another layer of property tax relief. Sometimes people will ask, who invented this really complex property tax system that we've got? And the answer is, nobody invented it. It's just an accumulation of efforts over successive assessment crises, property tax crises in 1980, 1990, 1996, 2003, and 2008. And then, as you see, there's a blip upward after 2021. If you take a look at the next slide, that was the result of the pandemic. And this is what's happened to home prices, the actual selling prices of houses in Indiana as measured by all the transactions, an index of all the transactions. You can see in the 90s and the double O's, the increase was usually between 2.5% and 4%, and it never topped 5%. And then during the Great Recession, home values actually declined for 4 years in a row. But starting in the 20-teens, you can see home prices accelerating. They start to top 5% per year in 2018. And then here came the pandemic, and we saw enormous increases in home values. That has never happened in Indiana before. That's what happens in California, not in Indiana, but there it is. You can see that increase. And our property tax system and all those layers of property tax relief were not designed to handle something like that, something that had never happened before. Now, that increase slacked off a little bit in 2023 at 7.6%. And in 2024, so far, it looks like it's going to be in the mid sixes, but that's still quite a bit more than we were used to in the 90s and the double O's. Next slide, please. Now, our assessment system is based on market value in use. That is what the assessors are trying to do when they set the assessed value of your home, is to predict what your house could sell for if you put it on the market. So it's market value in use, that is, as a house, not converted to some other use. What is it worth? How much would it sell for? That came out of an Indiana Supreme Court decision called Town of St. John in 1998. So the assessors are attempting to capture what happens to selling prices. And as you can see, they have succeeded. Our assessment system works. Take a look back in the Great Recession. Assessed values went down, and they began to accelerate towards the end of the 20-teens. And then sure enough, in 2023 and 24, we saw a great big increase in the assessed value of homes and of other property. Excuse me. Now, it turns out that assessed value, or the taxes, I should say, and assessed values lag what happens in the economy by 2 years. What happened in 2021 affected assessments in 2022, which affected taxes in 2023. So 2023 and 2024, those big increases in assessed value are the result of what happened in the economy as a result of the pandemic in 2021 and 2022. Next slide, please. So when assessed values go up, taxes tend to go up, and that certainly did happen over the last couple of years. The blue bars are what happened in 23. The red bars are what happened in 24. You can see homestead property tax bills went up 17% in 2023 and 6.6% in 2024. Look across the board there. Rental housing, which is non-homestead residential, farmland assessment or taxes, business taxes on land and buildings, that's real property. Business personal property didn't go up, that's business equipment. But in total, tax bills went up 10.2%. But homeowners and farmers, as you can see, got hit the hardest. Now you'll notice that in 24, the homestead taxes went up only 6.6%, whereas rental housing continued to rise at 13%. The reason for that was an increase in deductions by the legislature. The legislature increased one of the main deductions that are subtracted from the assessed value of homes, and that kept taxes from rising as much as they had in 2023. Next slide, please. So the question is, what can be done? And I've got 5 possible policies here, the kinds of policies that we've used in the past. So policies to reduce property taxes. Every one of these policies has some good points and some bad points. There are costs to be paid, trade-offs with every policy that you might adopt. The first policy listed there is limit assessed value increases. And this has been tried in the past in Indiana, and the courts usually reject it. Indiana Supreme Court says that our assessment standard is market value in use. And so if you put artificial limits on the actual assessments, if we would say, hey, instead of allowing home values to home assessments to rise 20%, let's keep them from rising that much. Let's set them at 5%. If that was challenged in courts would probably reject it. So probably we're not going to try limiting assessed value increases. Limiting rates and levies. Well, limiting the tax rate probably won't work in this case because the rate times the assessed value is the tax bill. And if assessed values are going up, and even if you keep the rate steady, tax bills will go up. So rate limits probably won't work. We have rate limits on some of the referendum funds, and sure enough, referendum revenues, referendum taxes went up a whole lot in 2023 in particular. Limiting levies, on the other hand, could be effective and is effective. In fact, we have a maximum levy in Indiana, which restricts the amount that local governments can raise in property taxes. The maximum levy doesn't apply to all parts of the property tax, though. It doesn't apply to debt. It doesn't apply to referendums, but it applies to everything else. And it was effective in holding down the increase in levies. And the legislature in 2024 tightened up the maximum levy limits that we used. I just lost my screen. There we go. One thing that limiting levies means, though, is that local governments get less revenue for services. And so perhaps won't be able to provide as much as they would like or as the voters would like. Deductions for particular property owners. Homeowners get enormous deductions. The standard deduction, the supplemental deduction for homeowners reduces the taxable assessed value to about half of what the assessors put on the value. So great big deductions for homeowners are effective in reducing taxes for homeowners. The thing is, though, that when you put a deduction on one kind of property, it tends to shift taxes to all the other kinds of property. If you put in a deduction that reduces overall assessed value, you try to raise a levy, a particular levy off of a lower assessed value, you need a higher rate. Rates go up and other taxpayers pay more. So deductions shift taxes to other taxpayers. Deductions pretty popular with homeowners. The rest of the tax-paying property owners in Indiana probably not so enthusiastic about that idea. Then there's credits. Credits are subtractions from the property tax bill itself after the rates are calculated, and they come in 2 flavors, funded and unfunded. A funded credit means we say, hey, taxpayer, you pay less than what your tax bill says. We'll subtract a percentage, but we'll find money to replace the money that local governments lose when you don't pay your full property tax bill. Those could come from the state budget, and in the past we've done that. And in fact, about 4 percentage points of our 7% sales tax resulted from increases to pay down property taxes, that is, to replace property taxes. One of the things we've done over the last 50 years is shift taxes from property to sales. Now, I highly doubt that anyone's going to propose increasing the sales tax this year, but that certainly is what we've done in the past. We do have other funded credits, local funded credits. It's possible for counties to increase the local income tax and use that money to buy down the property tax, to apply credits to homeowner and other property tax payments. But that means, of course, that income taxes are higher when property taxes are reduced. And we've done a lot of that over the last 50 years, shifting property taxes to income. So one of the ways we've reduced property taxes over the last 50 years is to raise income and sales taxes in order to reduce property taxes, and funded credits are the mechanism we use to do that. Then there are unfunded credits, and an unfunded credit simply says, taxpayer, you don't have to pay your whole tax bill, and local governments, that's just tough. Local governments end up collecting less revenue from an unfunded credit. We have a big program of unfunded credits called the circuit breaker credits, and we voted those into the Constitution back in 2010. They reduce property taxes on average by about 10% each year, and that's a 10% reduction in property tax payments, but a 10% loss of revenue, or a 10% reduction in the property taxes that local governments can collect. So these are the sorts of policies that we're likely to see. If you want to take a look, Senate Bill 1 is posted now on the General Assembly's website and contains the new administration's proposals for property tax relief. It's a combination of higher deductions and some new credits that are calculated. The size of the credits are calculated in some interesting new ways. So you can take a look at that. I would advise looking at the fiscal note first if you're not an attorney, and that'll give you a brief description of what the law is proposing and what the impact on local governments and state governments might be. If you're interested, I have a couple of papers I've written about this for a more detailed explanation. They were done for the Indiana Fiscal Policy Institute, the IFPI. You can find it on their website if you click on publications. So that's what we have to say. It's going to be a very interesting session for property tax relief. Senate Bill 1 will undoubtedly be amended. The House will probably come up with their own version, and the two houses and the administration will have to negotiate the final result. But almost certainly we're going to see some action for property tax relief.
Thank you so much, Larry, for that presentation. It's very helpful to have a better understanding of how we got to this point. Although property taxes are extremely complicated, you make it seem less intimidating to grasp. And I promise you, every time I've seen, this is probably the second presentation I've seen of yours and talked to you as well, and I learn something new every time. So thank you so much for being with us today and for giving us that information.
No, you're welcome. Happy to do it.
And so our next guest, Ryan Hoff, will be able to build on that understanding. I promise you, you're going to walk away feeling as though you too can talk about property taxes. Ryan is a graduate of Indiana University and Ohio Northern School of Law. Ryan has been a registered lobbyist for over 20 years, including more than 10 years representing the Association of Indiana Counties. I have had the pleasure of working collaboratively with Ryan for many, many years. I can't tell you how appreciative I am that you have been able to join us today. It's great to chat with you outside of the State House. Are you ready to talk to us about the current state of property taxes?
I sure am. Busy time in the State House, obviously, and a lot going on. And hopefully we'll be able to give you a bit more of the background on how the property tax base works.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you. So just a brief word about the Association of Indiana Counties. We are a nonprofit entity representing county governments at the state level. All 92 counties are members of ours. Also, each of what kind of the row offices within county government, the commissioners, the council, the recorders, the clerks, the assessors, and so on, all kind of fall under our umbrella. So with that, the first discussion point is about local property tax funding. So obviously property taxes are a primary source of funding for local government units. And that includes all the government units, not just counties, counties, cities, towns, townships, libraries, special districts. I've included for you on this slide kind of the statewide average revenue distribution for each property tax dollar. Now, of course, that'll be different in every location, but this is kind of a big picture view as it was at least in 2018. So that has changed some. Sorry, that was the most recent information I could find on that, but gives you an idea of where your property tax dollars go. So for the county, that's jail, law enforcement, provides for your elections, drainage, economic development work that the county does, tax administration, roads and bridges, courts is obviously a big one for counties, even though that is a state administered system. The county is assigned to foot the bill for the state's court system. So, where people like to say that none of the property tax dollars go to the state, but they do cover some of the costs that the state otherwise would incur. For the township, that's your fire and often EMS service, poor relief, cemeteries. For cities and towns, again, law enforcement, fire, trash, parks, etc. School, obviously education, but that is the biggest portion of the property tax bill goes to schools. Libraries are obvious. Special units may include fire districts, fire territories, and solid waste districts. Some of the other ways local government is funded is, as was mentioned, local option and income taxes, which are a growing source of revenue for local government. Also, you may have a food and beverage tax or an innkeeper's tax that apply in your county or city and town. Next slide, please. So property taxes obviously represent your portion of the local government budgeted spending for the current year. Increases or decreases depend upon a local government's fiscal management, as well as the assessed valuation of a property and or local tax rates. As Larry mentioned, and I'll go into a little more detail later, but there's a statutory allowed growth to keep up sort of with inflation, but the mechanism doesn't necessarily reflect that. But the decisions that make up your tax bill are the purview of all of the different layers of local government. So school decisions, school fiscal decisions, city fiscal decisions, county fiscal decisions, all can impact your property tax bill, but they also can impact the revenue share that each unit receives out of the property tax bill. So whereas on the previous slide, you kind of had the average breakdown, but in each locality, it's going to be different because of the fiscal decisions that your elected officials have made. But one of the main takeaways from today that I want to educate everyone on is that the system is set up in this basic fashion, that as assessed valuation goes up, your tax rate should go down, and vice versa. As the AV goes down through tax cuts for someone, rate goes up. Now that is if all else remains the same. There are a lot of ways baked into the system currently that can prevent that mechanism from happening. Whereas, in some places, fiscal decisions have meant that as AV goes up, that just turns into revenue for one or all of the units, and it prevents the rate from going down. So that can happen. But also, the loss of assessed valuation means that rates will stay higher. And we'll talk about that as we talk about the proposals for various types of property tax reductions for various classes of property owners. Next slide, please. So when properties reach their cap, the unpaid portion of the property tax burden shifts onto other taxpayers and other property tax classes that are not yet at their cap. So if you live in a city or town, you are probably more likely to be at the cap already because you have the added layer of property tax rate applied to your bill as the city or town rate. So homeowners who are in unincorporated areas of the state where you're not paying that city or town rate already, those properties are the most at risk for tax shifts from other property classes because their rate is still below the tax caps. And when cap losses occur, they occur to all the units allocated proportionally, so they all lose a portion of revenue when properties have reached the cap. Which means that there are weird situations where if you live in a city or town and are at the property tax cap, that means that you as a taxpayer are not paying the same amount as for those county services as folks in the unincorporated area. For example, you're a city resident who's at the cap due to the application of the city rate. You receive the same countywide services, but the sharing of the cap loss among all units means that your cost for that service is lower than folks in the unincorporated area. And so that's, just one of the weird outcomes that is baked into the system today, which kind of leads a lot of officials to lean on the local income tax more heavily than in previous years. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the growth rate at which local units are able to access more money out of the property tax base. And that function is called the max levy growth quotient. And this is the maximum amount of property tax dollars that may be levied in any budget year, how much that is allowed to grow. And it's based on the annual statewide levy growth factor, which is the 6-year average of non-farm personal income. And that amount is calculated every year by the state and applied to every unit's budgets, unless they have a max levy growth appeal saying that their unit has grown faster than the average. But the functionality of this calculation is that not only is it very much affected by changes in the economy, because it's affected by income growth, but it reflects a taxpayer's ability to pay, not the cost of inflation to those units of government that need to access money out of the property tax base. Another big takeaway is that this is the basic calculation for how your bill is calculated. What is your assessment after deductions and credits multiplied by the rate? That's your bill. But again, while a lot of the focus in recent year has been on changes in assessment, and I guess rightfully so, because they've been changing pretty quickly, the rate side is also really, really important. And your bill changes based on either assessment changes or rate changes. And one thing to be really aware of is, have there been new rates added where you live? Has there been a school referendum adding a rate that is outside the property tax caps? Or we've seen in a lot of parts of the state creation of new fire territories or fire districts. This is a big conversation at the State House going on right now, as the public and legislators and our members as well, we've recognized that in a lot of parts of rural Indiana, the service for fire and EMS response has declined, in some cases declined greatly, as you move away from, again, not everywhere, but in several places, as you move away from volunteer fire service that is delivered at a far lower cost. If your volunteer service is no longer able to meet the needs of the residents, either because you can't get it's largely because you can't get volunteers anymore to fill those services, you often have to start paying for a professional service. And that has caused real increases in several locations because their rate has changed when you add a new fire rate or an EMS rate on top of your property tax bill. And I've been trying to point out to a lot of folks that in a lot of ways, the property tax base in Indiana is spoken for. Anytime you add services, like with a fire territory, that can cause big rate increases. At the same time, when I say that the property tax base is spoken for, anytime you propose tax cuts on one or multiple property tax classes, that can be really bad for how you pay for local government services. So there's no easy answers anymore in the property tax space. Next slide, please. So when we talk about property tax proposals, and Larry mentioned Senate Bill 1 as a proposal, something you'll want to keep in mind when you look at any property tax proposal in this or any other legislative session is that any proposed reduction in one class of property is going to have some level of impact on other classes of property. If you think back to what I mentioned earlier, as AV goes up, the rate goes down, vice versa. If the AV goes down, like through a property tax reduction, your rate stays higher. So, for example, there's multiple property tax reduction bills on offer this legislative session. Some are focused on business personal property. Some are focused on the base rate for agricultural land. There's one bill that I testified on just last week that would have removed $9 billion out of the ag base in Indiana. But like I said, as AV goes down, like through that property tax cut, rates would stay higher. So I urge you, as you are considering all of the property tax bills this legislative session, keep this in mind, that any changes within the base is going to have a subsequent impact on other users or other members of the property tax base as well. So that wraps up my portion for today, and hopefully I can answer questions later on if there is time.
Thank you, Ryan. I am a homeowner, and I swear every time we talk about this, my head still sort of swims with all of that information to try to understand what's going on, especially here in Indiana. AARP Indiana definitely believes that property taxes are critical to the well-being of our communities. However, they can also cause residents to struggle, threatening our communities. But with all of that said, something to emphasize that I think you even brought up, that no matter what lever you pull, it shifts that burden to someone else. So we know these discussions are delicate, and it's imperative that we're thoughtful about the entire situation. And that's why AARP Indiana believes in targeted tax relief for those who need it most, so that we preserve our communities, but while maintaining essential revenue, especially continued funding for vital services that help residents stay in their homes as they age. So we really appreciate you being here with us. Thank you so much. Hopefully we can try to put your slides somewhere for folks to see in case they need to go back, because I know I sure do. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow, so much information, and we aren't even done yet. It is my esteemed honor to bring our next guest on, State Senator Travis Holdman. He will be a key voice in the property tax discussion this session. Senator Holdman has served Hoosiers since 2008 as a member of the Indiana Senate. He represents Senate District 19, which includes Adams, Blackford, Jay, and Wells counties, and a portion of Allen County. Holdman is the Senate Majority Caucus Chair. He serves as the chair of the Senate Committee on Tax and Fiscal Policy, and is a member of the Senate Committee on Appropriations and the Senate Committee on Rules and Legislative Procedures. He is an attorney at Travis Holdman Law Office. Senator Holdman, thank you so much for taking time this morning to be with us. I know how busy you are. I'm very grateful that you can share your expertise with us. Are you ready to dive into some of the questions I have for you today?
Amber, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Thanks. It's great to see you. On the first day of session, Senator, the Indiana Senate Majority announced their priorities for 2025, which included property tax reform. We are now only a few weeks into session, although it might feel like a little bit more, and so much has already happened. Can you kind of give us a snapshot of where things stand right now in terms of the legislative process?
Well, we just finished our second week of committees. It was our first week for Tax and Fiscal Policy Committee meeting yesterday. We meet on Tuesday mornings. We will have 4 meetings, and next week, next Tuesday's meeting, we will roll out Senate Bills 6, 7, 8, and 9. We'll hear all of those 4 bills, which are priority bills on property tax reform. And I'm really excited about some of those, especially Senate Bill 6. If you haven't taken a look at it, it's the property tax deferral program, which allows for an individual, if the county chooses this option, and it has to be approved by the county council in all 92 counties to do this program. But a taxpayer can defer from $100 up to $500 per year off of their tax bill. They can do that up to $10,000, which means if you take the maximum of $500 a year, you could take 20 years of $500 deferral. But here's the catch. If you do that, the deferral document becomes a lien on your property. So if the property is transferred even from the homeowner to a trust, if they are deceased and it moves through the estate, or they sell the property to go to a nursing home or to relocate, then that lien has to be satisfied. And it will have an interest rate bearing on it of probably 3 or 4%. We're trying to settle yet on what that looks like. Senator Rogers from Granger, Indiana, has carried that bill, and I think it provides a great option. We've had, I think, about 5 other states have done this, and so we took a look at what other states have done. That has been a very popular method of providing property tax relief, especially to senior citizens. But if you take $500 off of your property tax bill, that's a significant reduction in your bill. But it will have to be satisfied at some point in time. But hopefully, when you relocate or it goes through an estate, it's all settled up at that point. So we think that's got some good merit. Senate Bill 7 is Senator Buchanan's bill that has to do with changing the capitalization rate for farm ground from 8% to 9%, which provides some relief to farmers. Senate Bill 8 has to do with taxing unit referenda. Principally, schools are the most the unit that uses this method the most to have a referenda to raise property taxes typically for capital projects, but sometimes for operating expenses. To move that to November only in even numbered years. We have found that the success rate seems to be higher for schools, especially when those referenda, when people go to the polls to vote on the referenda, is done at primary time in municipal elections. But you could have people that are not part of a municipality. They're not going to vote for a mayor because they live outside of the city limit, but they're still within the school district. And so there's a disconnect. So if people don't get the newspaper and they don't talk to folks much about what's going on in the community, there'd be a vote that they wouldn't even know took place. And so it's compelling on us to move that date for referenda to the November even numbered year elections, because that's when you're going to see the most voters turn out. We have a bill that's Senate Bill 9, which is Senator Baldwin's bill, which deals with the MLGQ. That's the maximum levy growth quotient. That is the amount of increase that a taxing unit can increase their revenue from one year to the next. We have an arbitrary number that we have set that Chairman Thompson in the House Ways and Means and I agreed to last year to set that at 4%, even though the calculation for the MLGQ would have it at over 5%. But there's a limitation on the amount of revenue that can be raised from one year to the next. But oddly enough, referenda is on top of that MLGQ. So the MLGQ in reality is about 5.1% throughout the state, because of that referenda and the debt that local school corporations and cities and towns have that have passed referenda, which drive that MLGQ up so that folks are seeing increased property tax. I can tell you that the average property tax bill will increase statewide at 7% coming up here in just a couple of months when those are mailed out to folks. And so it's just a warning to you. It's not going to be 18 or 30%, but the average, and keep in mind that's the average. Some will be lower, some will be higher, but the statewide average is 7%. Is what we're finding out from our statisticians here at the State House, state government, that the increase will be for homestead property owners in 2025. So with that, I'd be glad to answer questions you may have, Amber.
Thank you for that rundown, Senator. I think that that was really helpful. When you talk about the levy and all of those percentages and how that adds into property taxes, I think that is oftentimes something that most folks don't think about or have heard about. So it's really important for us to have that conversation. And thanks for going through those bills. I think what I'm about to talk about here in a little bit is one of our suggested proposals that we've been talking about with legislators from AARP Indiana's perspective is definitely a deferral program. So it's nice to hear that is on the table and is out there for folks. So we appreciate that. I know that we are at our time, but I do just want to say thank you so much. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I noticed that you didn't mention Senate Bill 1, which you are the author of, and it is a pretty hefty bill that will probably take a little bit longer to talk about, but just wanted to give you the opportunity if you had anything to say about that or anything else that you would want to mention for viewers on here about property taxes before we let you go.
Senate Bill 1 is Governor Braun's bill, and I'm carrying that bill for him. My concern with the bill is just the price tag that it has on local government, which is $1.1 billion in the first year, and it grows up to $1.6 billion, which directly impacts local government services. We're trying to reach a compromise. I have a meeting tomorrow with the governor to talk specifically about this issue, and the House and the Senate are in constant contact with one another. I have met with Governor Braun's people before he was even governor for probably the last 8 weeks on a regular weekly basis, his staff, to talk about Senate Bill 1. We'll get something that we think people will be happy with, but at the same time, we can't hamper the revenue stream going to local government because it's going to affect the police departments and fire departments and local services that are provided by counties and cities and towns. And so we'll find a path, but it's going to take some hard work. But right now I'm kind of up to my eyeballs on property tax. One thing I do want to mention, Amber, if I can just talk about one more bill, Senate Bill 451, which is a bill that I'm carrying, allows for a reduction in the individual income tax rate. Right now, we're on the path to reduce individual income tax, down to 2.9% in 2027. What Senate Bill 451 does, it says beginning in 2030, we would reduce individual income tax by 0.05% each even numbered years if our revenue growth exceeds 3%. Governor Braun has said that government doesn't need to grow more than 3% a year, and that should be the benchmark. So if we have revenues that exceed that 3% watermark, we basically give that money back to the taxpayer by way of individual income tax reduction. So hopefully that bill gets some traction. It passed out of committee yesterday, 13-0. So regardless of which party you belong to, it was unanimous vote to move it out of committee. So we were happy about that. But that's something to keep your eye on as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator Holdman. And I think, something that I even mentioned when I was talking with Ryan earlier is that from AARP Indiana perspective, we understand that this is a very delicate situation, and there are layers upon layers of what our property tax system looks like. But we know that whatever lever you pull, I will state this again, that it can, that shift goes to someone else. So we want to make sure, we talk about aging in place, and we really want to make sure that folks have those essential services in their local communities, because that is also very important for individuals to be able to stay in their homes and communities. So we really appreciate this thoughtful conversation. And again, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. And we look forward to more conversations as all of these things are moving through the process. So I just wanted to say thanks again.
Thank you. I'm sorry I ran over a little bit. So.
Oh, no, this was perfect. This is what we're here for. We want folks to hear what's going on and to know what's out there, and especially what people can get involved in, and to kind of keep their eye on as session goes along. So thank you again. We really appreciate you.
Thank you to AARP for your service to our constituency. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator.
Great day, folks. Bye-bye.
Well, now for our final guest for today's program is Robert Ordway. Robert is a senior policy advisor for Governor Mike Braun. He previously served as deputy legislative director to then Senator Braun in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining that office, he was a director at the American Legislative Exchange Council. He began his start in D.C. as a Washington Scholars Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Robert, it's so great to have you here. I know Governor Braun just took office a little under 2 weeks ago. I can only imagine how busy it's been. So I'll just turn it over to you to talk about Governor Braun's efforts on property tax relief, since it, I know, is at the top of his agenda.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Amber, and AARP for having me speak on behalf of the governor. It's a great opportunity to talk about his freedom and opportunity agenda, and a big piece of that is property tax reform. Back when he was a candidate and he traveled the state, this was by far the number one issue. And even when he was a senator, he traveled to all 92 counties every year for 6 years, and was really on the beat as it relates to workforce development, affordable housing, and things of that nature. Rural broadband, I'd say, is top three. But when he was deciding to transition to the governor's office, on the campaign trail, the property tax issue, particularly for homestead filers, was by far the number one issue. And so as we dug into the issue over the past year or so, come to find out that the burden over the past, I'd say about decade, around 2016, it was about a third between what we'd call the ones, twos, and threes. That burden started to shift more on the homestead filers. And so now it's about 45% of the burden is on those folks. And so we've tried to come up with a reasonable policy to get introduced. And we thank the previous speaker, Senator Holdman, for carrying that bill, SB 1. I guess the top line of it is really what we want to do is we want to cut, cap, and reform property tax in Indiana. So, by cut, we want to roll back to the Bill 21 pay 22 levels. When it comes to capping, we've got kind of two buckets. We've got 3% per year for basically all the ones, twos, and threes. But then we create a special populations group, whether you're retired, lower income, or you have children. Those property tax bills would be capped at 2% growth per year, because good tax policy is all about predictability and reliability. And Hoosiers over the last couple of years have seen spikes as great as 10% plus. And so we've got to, kind of bring that back into the right cadence going forward. Last component's reform. So again, schools are a big driver of, funding in the last few years. And so we believe in the referendum process, but at the end of the day, we want to move it to even year general elections when you have high turnout. So there's more folks that are involved in the conversation, but then also a little bit of transparency around the actual referendum question. So, in the past, it's always about rates and levy, and, Hoosiers are smart folks, but not all of them work at the DLGF and can get in the weeds on the math. But the reality is, your tax rate can go down, but your property taxes can actually go up. And so from a transparency perspective, we like to look at it as basically saying, tax district X wants Y dollars for a Z project for X amount of years, and then an anticipated amount in percentage that someone's property tax would go up. So it's very crystal clear of when those folks vote yes or no, what they're essentially signing up for. And then the last piece of the bill is really just property tax transparency. And so we want to set up a portal on the state website. And so any property taxpayer can see exactly what they owe and where things are headed, and just having more of a better understanding of how the bills are related. But as the previous speaker, especially Professor DeBoer, property tax, I think I read a white paper that Indiana's property tax system is one of the most, if not the most complicated in the entire United States. And so over the last half century, we've seen, essentially the constituents reach out to the legislature, and I won't use the word complain, but have concerns about taxes going up. And for that past 50 years, the legislature has responded in various ways. But as it was mentioned before, when you touch one thing, you almost break two or three other things. And so when you try to do a one size fits all policy, there will be challenges. But I think at the end of the day, this is a great starting point. And as you've heard, there are other bills out there related to property tax reform, and the governor's open to taking, his piece of clay and seeing how it can be molded through the process. And hopefully we create a win-win for everybody at the end of this first session. But as you mentioned before, we've only been here a little over a week, and, starting behind the legislature, make sure we're, it's like turning on the treadmill and then jumping on it in a sprint. So here we are.
That analogy just made me laugh. I can only imagine how that is feeling for you, Robert. We really appreciate you being here with us today and giving us some insight as to where the governor stands on this important issue and how he's looking to provide some relief. Hopefully, we can continue these conversations since there is a lot out there and a lot of things can change over the course of a long session. But we really appreciate that information, and hopefully we can continue to all jump on the treadmill and stay on there, even if it is moving before we get on. So thank you.
Yeah, sounds like a plan. Thank you.
Kind of going off of that same conversation, relief is something that the almost 800,000 AARP members in Indiana and all older Hoosiers are hoping for this session. AARP understands that property taxes are critical for our local communities in funding essential services, including schools and first responders. But many older Hoosiers may be unable to afford property tax increases on top of other rising monthly expenses like utilities, groceries, and healthcare. That's why AARP Indiana is making suggestions about how to help in those efforts, which I sort of mentioned when talking to Senator Holdman. For example, requiring that information about current property tax relief programs be printed or sent with property tax bills. Many property tax relief programs are underutilized because the intended recipients, often older taxpayers, are unaware that these programs exist. Some of you might already notice this information on your bill, but it's not uniform across the board. Encouraging more counties to offer monthly payment options. Many homeowners can't afford to pay an annual or semi-annual property tax bill out of their monthly income. There are several counties that offer this option, but again, we'd like to see more do so. Creating a statewide tax credit to provide relief to Indiana homeowners 65 and older who have the highest property tax burden in relation to their household income. This would be income-based and not determined by assessed value. Allowing older Hoosiers to delay paying a portion of their property taxes until their home is sold or their estate is settled. At that time, the taxes would be paid back with interest. That's actually something that Senator Holdman brought up. It's a deferral program. So looking forward to having more conversation around that as well. So thanks to Senator Holdman for that conversation and bringing that to folks' attention. In order to help state leaders to better understand how increasing property taxes impacts older homeowners in Indiana, AARP commissioned a poll of 1,001 registered Indiana voters aged 50 plus who own a home in the state in December of 2024. And the findings showed that after seeing steep increases in property taxes over the past several years, older Hoosiers are increasingly worried about the financial pressure these taxes are causing and are looking towards state leaders to provide relief. And it sounds like from this conversation today, and hopefully, as we already know, that's happening right now at the State House, and leaders are doing just that. So going back to our poll, the results showed the following. 84% of older Indiana voters who are homeowners report that they've experienced an increase in their property tax bill over the past 3 years. 66% consider the amount they pay for property taxes to be high, and 60% say that changes in property taxes 60% say that changes in property taxes over the past 3 years increased their overall household budget. On this slide, you'll notice that 2/3 or 66% of older Indiana voters across party lines think policymakers need to make lowering property taxes for homeowners a priority in 2025. And here on the slide, you can see that 72% were Republican, 61% Independent, and 57% Democrat. And as I have continuously said, we heard Senator Holdman today and many other legislators, they are making sure that they are discussing this and making this a priority. Our proposals for reducing the financial burden of property taxes, which I discussed on the first 2 slides, actually received overwhelming support from older Hoosiers. 76% support Indiana implementing a new statewide tax credit for older homeowners. And again, that would be based on income and not assessed value. And then 74% support allowing all Hoosiers to pay property taxes on a monthly basis. You can see the full survey results at www.aarp.org/IN property tax poll. Well, that hour went fast. I would like to thank our guests as well as all of you who joined us today. I hope that you found it as informative as I did. This is not the last time that we will be talking about this or trying to educate everyone around the property tax situation here in Indiana. But now, because we are at our time, I will hand it back to Sarah to close us out.
All right, Amber, thank you. I think that was a great hour. I know I learned a ton. And unfortunately, we arrived at the conclusion of the event. And I know that you all got as much good information out of it as I did. If you have questions about deductions or relief eligibility, your best contact is going to be your county auditor. They are going to be able to give you the best information about your specific situation. You can also visit a website that should be up on your screen now from the AARP Foundation, and it's a good resource as well. At the start of the hour, I mentioned that we would let you know about how you can join AARP Indiana in our efforts on this issue. Or really any issue that impacts older adults. And what you can do is scan this QR code, and it's going to allow you to sign up to receive our advocacy alerts. You can also receive text alerts from us by following the directions that you see here on the screen. And that's it, folks. That's it for property taxes today, but I encourage you to stay tuned to AARP Indiana because, as you heard, this is just the beginning of this conversation, and there's a lot of time for things to change and conversations to be had throughout the session. Want to thank you all for joining us, thanking our guests, and hope that you all have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.